So it's been a really weird few days between Yair Rodriguez and Jeremy Stevens ever since the main event. Lots gone on. I think now that they've actually rebooked this fight, I think it's a good time to go back and recap everything that has happened and then just kind of look forward to the fight that we're going to get in October. So that's going to be coming on October 18th. I believe the main event on that card will be Dominic Reyes and Chris Weidman, which is a pretty interesting fight at light heavyweight. It's worth noting, though, with this being a co-main event, this is going to be a 3-round fight instead of a 5-round fight, which it originally was scheduled for. So you go from having a 5-round fight at 7,000 feet of elevation in Mexico City to being a 3-round fight in Boston, which is pretty close to sea level. But with that being said, so this all started in the main event. Yair Rodriguez comes out strong, lands a couple of kicks. And one of the things when you're fighting a guy like Jeremy Stevens, a guy who's got the kind of knockout power he does, it's one of those things where when you're striking with him, you want to be out of range. You want to get in range quick to get your shots off, and then you want to get back out of range as quick as possible. And so Yair is kind of in this position where he was still in range, and while he was trying to get out, he was trying to use his arm to post away and get out of range that way. And when he did it, he had his hand open, and as he was pushing away, he ended up breaking down and raking down on Jeremy Stevens' eye. Ended up causing an eye spasm for Jeremy Stevens. So from there, I think it's worth noting that most of the people who are going to be watching this video, most of the people who watched the fight were watching it on ESPN or ESPN Plus. So you actually got to see the camera angles where they were like having up close camera footage of Jeremy Stevens. You can really see his eye up close. But for the fans in attendance, there's a good chance they didn't see that. So they didn't know how bad the spasm was. And with that being said, they were probably also a little drunk. So for all they know, he was just kind of squinting. They didn't know whether or not it was an actual spasm. I think if you've done anything athletic in your life, you've probably at some point have had some sort of eye spasm. I've had them before. It's never been as bad as what Jeremy Stevens had, where it lasted a whole 5 minutes. But I had like a time in a jiu-jitsu tournament, for example, where it was in a gi tournament. I ended up coming up on a sweep, and I don't even know how it happened exactly. I don't know if the gi was my opponent's gi was just kind of like hanging there or what happened, but whatever happened, it like scraped across my eye, and my eye just like kind of closed up and sort of spasmed. So for them, for like the rest of the match, unfortunately, there was only like 20 seconds left at that point. But for the rest of the match, like my eye was just closed, and it wasn't like something I was trying to do, but it was just like staying closed on its own. So when I saw what was happening with Stevens, I was like, oh, he's got an eye spasm here. He's not actually like closing his eye on its own. Like this is his eye, like physically doing it for him. So like he can want it to be open as much as he wants. It's just not going to open right there. So it does last the whole 5 minutes. It doesn't open after 5 minutes. I say, you know what, look, like we gave you all your time, your eye's still closed. Like we can't have you fight with one eye. So they end the fight there. So I think at that point, and I think it's worth mentioning, I don't know whether or not Yair saw that. I don't know what Yair was able to see from Jeremy Stevens. He may have just like seen him in the corner, kind of like looking off to the side and talking to Herb Dean. So maybe he didn't know that Stevens' eye was spasming. Whatever he was thinking, he seemed to believe that Stevens should have found a way to continue going. But I think if you understand what Stevens was dealing with, there's no reasonable reason to believe that Stevens was trying to find a way out, especially after 14 seconds. I think this is one of those things where even if you had a reputation as a guy who does these types of things where they try to like embellish fouls, a guy like Josh Koscheck, if this had happened to Josh Koscheck, I'd still tend to believe that he wasn't faking, and we're talking about Josh Koscheck here. But now that we're like referring to the guy who it actually happened to, and Jeremy Stevens, Stevens is not a guy who has a reputation for this kind of stuff. So to me, I'd never had an issue with what happened to Stevens, and I never really blamed it on him. For Yair Rodriguez, he's having a bit of a temper tantrum. He's like climbing on the cage, having a temper tantrum. Eventually, when Michael Bisping goes to interview him, he like slaps Michael Bisping's hand away and yells at him. For Yair Rodriguez, I understand that there is a level of frustration in that you finally get to main event a card in Mexico. This is a big opportunity for you if you win. Obviously, there's one bonus to be made. There could potentially be a of the night bonus to be made. But on top of that, this could be a star-making performance for you. And to have it all go away in 14 seconds on an eye poke, that's frustrating. Granted, he's the one who did the eye poke, but from the way the poke looked, it didn't look worse than some of the other pokes we've seen. But again, this is also 14 seconds in, so they're not really all that sweaty. So it's probably a drier hand than it otherwise would be if it's later on in a fight. That could make a difference in terms of scratching an eye. But either way, he seemed to just lose his mind there. If you're going to give him the benefit of the doubt, you would just assume that he didn't see the replay or see what we saw on TV and know that Stevens just couldn't do anything about his eye closing. But even still, it felt like he was going over the line with it. And he made some comments afterwards saying, hey, look, maybe this is legit, but if Stevens was faking it, like he's going to have to live with that for the rest of his life. And that's a line that he kept going to. Then they met each other in the hotel the next day. said something similar like, "Hey, look, man, like if you could have gone, like you're gonna regret that for the rest of your life." Sort of implying, "Hey, I think there's a chance you might have been faking it." And at that point, Stevens didn't want any of that, so he ended up like shoving him in the hotel, and they got into a little bit of a mini scuffle there. No one threw any punches or anything, but there was a bit of a scuffle there. But with this just being like the main story from the main event of the current UFC card, it's been something that's been talked about a lot ever since then. Jeremy Stevens went on Ariel Helwani's show and saying, "Hey, look, man, like I don't back out of fights. I'm not trying to find a way out. Like I come from the streets, you come from a karate school," which I think is one of the douchiest lines I've ever heard. But like I said, I'm on Jeremy Stevens' side of it, and I get what he was trying to say. Where he's like, "I'm not the kind of guy who's gonna like try to find a way out here." But it was still like a really dumb line. But that I think that's kind of beside the point. It's just something that I feel like it was worth mentioning because it's something I've been joking about with some of my friends. But to me, it just didn't seem right. For the most part, I was on Stevenson's side because, like I said, it's not like he could physically control it. Like if your body does something involuntary, like what are you gonna do about it? Like there's just nothing you can do about it. And everyone tried their best. Their Herb Dean tried to give him as much time as possible. The doctor didn't really go in and like make a final call until after the 5 minutes. And I'm sure Stevens would have, if he could have opened his eye, he would have. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. But Yair Rodriguez definitely came across pretty poorly here. Came across as a bit of a petulant baby. There were some people who were blaming him for all the fans throwing stuff in the octagon. It didn't help that he was climbing on the octagon and yelling and sort of like waving it on as they were throwing stuff in. But with that being said, he never like physically like took the mic and said, "Hey, everyone, start throwing your shit in the octagon." Like you kind of have to hold the people who did the crime accountable. And if the crime here is throwing shit in the octagon, like that's on the fans. It's not necessarily on your. Yair didn't help matters, but I wouldn't blame him for it either. But now that they're going to be in Boston, unfortunately for them, like I mentioned before, it's going to be a shorter fight. It's not going to be in a main event spot. Wouldn't help Yair as much if he wins here. For Jeremy Stevens, I think it's just one of those fights where if he wins, then maybe he's a couple fights away from a title shot again, and then hopefully he actually makes it around this time. But it seems like every time he gets close, he ends up stumbling on the final step, whether it was with Jose Aldo or even before that, he had a fight with Max Holloway before Holloway ended up becoming a champion, where he could have worked his way up towards the top and ended up losing that. But for Stevens, it'd be a chance to work his way back into a title picture slowly but surely. For Yair, there was a real opportunity for him to become a star, and that didn't really work out for him. But at least we are getting the fight again. It seems like there actually is a real grudge here, whereas before there really wasn't much of a storyline. As I mentioned in my podcast, like the storyline that ESPN and the UFC were trying to make was like, oh, well, they're fighting in Mexico, and Jeremy Stevens thinks he's Mexican, and Yair is Mexican, so yeah, watch the fight. Now there's actually like a real grudge there, so at least in that way, it'll be interesting. For Yair, maybe not the best guy to have a grudge. Maybe not the best guy you'd want to have a grudge against you with Jeremy Stevens. Stevens is one of those guys where he's not the kind of guy where if he knocks you down, he's gonna look back at the ref and see if the ref's about to jump in, and then like kind of hold off. If the ref's about to jump in, like he'll keep going until the ref peels you off of him. We saw that fight with Josh Emmett where he had Josh Emmett hurt badly, and then in the finishing strikes ends up breaking his jaw and really having a pretty harmful effect on Josh Emmett's career in that way. He's probably one of those guys where if he had specialized in submissions rather than knockouts, he could be a guy who we view as similar to Taquinho. So having that kind of a guy who has no problem, who can knock you up, and then beyond that has no problem just like pounding on you until the ref like gets in and like drags him off you. Maybe not the best idea, but that's sort of where we are now. So the fight wasn't the most interesting fight to me a week ago. It's gotten a lot more interesting now, at least from a storyline perspective. A lot of the same questions that are at play in terms of the technique are still there, in terms of like the flashiness of Yair versus the guy who just like kind of likes to set his feet and throw bombs in Jeremy Stevens. Although to be fair to Jeremy, he has a lot more weapons than that. He's a lot more technically skilled than that, but that's sort of what he's like developed a bit of a reputation for. So that's all still there, but at least now we have like an actual storyline between the two and an actual grudge there that we can care about. So I definitely look forward to seeing that, and definitely look forward to seeing the main event of that card in Boston on October 18th as well.